Hello, folks. Welcome aboard. I'm really excited that you're here to join in through this YouTube video. It's about 30 minutes. I walk you through how to deploy Hyperledger Fabric blockchain template essentially on AWS. Now, with AWS, there's two templates that are going to be available at the time of writing this video. Basically, it's just Hyperledger. Ethereum, still at the time of writing, was not fully available. However, that may have changed. But for the time being, please do follow the instructions on how to deploy the template on AWS. Now, I'm going to be honest. Most of the work is just to get ready to deploy the template on AWS. And what I mean is we need to configure security groups, our VPC. We need to also configure the firewall, and all kinds of other little tasks to get ready to deploy the templates so that it will work. So about 25 minutes of the video is just walking you through all the little details to get ready. Now, for those that would like to have some paper to follow on My Blockchain Experts, you can see that on the screen. There's a blog post on this as well, and feel free to download the PDF. That's part of the essentially the blog post as well. I hope to see you again in another video. Thanks for joining. Let's get started deploying the template. Let's talk about deploying AWS blockchain templates. Now, at the time of writing, there's currently templates available for Ethereum and Hyperledger Fabric. Before we get started, we need to talk about a few things. This is AWS. It's not as simple as deploying a template. Now, if you're not familiar with AWS, no worries. I'm going to walk you through everything, and do ensure you download the step-by-step instructions on how to do this, because again, there's more to this than just a simple discussion about AWS. And in reality, if you don't know what a VPC is, security groups, elastic IPs, etc., when I go through the step-by-step process, I'll point out at a high level what you need to know. But in reality, I'm not here to do AWS training. That's another subject for another day. And actually, the areas that we cover is literally going to be a one-week class with AWS. So please just be aware that I will get you going. But if you do have questions on why it's done like this, take a class with AWS or on the platform that you're watching the course. Now, okay. Now, we need to pay attention to where we want to deploy this. It's currently available in 3 regions. Now, I'm going to deploy this in Northern Virginia. And we're going to have to collect some information before we get started. Now, I've already deployed this before, so I have, for example, key pairs ready to go. I have security groups as well. I'm going to deploy this as a default T2 medium. And again, it's up to you to deploy this however you want. And I'll talk more about this, but this is going to use CloudFormation. CloudFormation is an infrastructure as code, basically, solution that allows cloud administrators to basically deploy a templated solution to essentially reduce as much manual labor as possible. Now, this is similar, CloudFormation is similar, for example, to Google Deployment Manager. But with that said, before we can do anything here, I need to walk you through the configuration areas that we have to set up before we can deploy this. So let's go ahead and go to the console. Now, what we want to do is, first of all, we're going to deploy this in Northern Virginia. I need to make sure that I'm in Northern Virginia. So pay attention to where you're at. It's very possible that you may be in Ohio or Northern California, and you're trying to deploy this. And when you try to deploy this with CloudFormation, you don't see your security groups or something, and that might be why, because you configured them in the wrong region. So please pay attention to this. This is one of the rookie mistakes that happens quite a bit. So just be aware of your region when you go to the console. Now, what I want to do is go to VPC. The first step I have to do is to create a VPC. Now I have two VPCs already here. I'm going to go to Launch Wizard. Now in the step-by-step instructions, I'm going to walk you through what we have to fill out here. The reason I'm going to use a wizard is because this should make it as easy as possible for folks that don't have AWS experience. So let's go ahead and select. Now, what I want to do is going to go ahead and populate a seeder block for us. I don't need to have IPv6. And once again, I'm going to just go through quickly what we need to get going. I'm just not able to sit here and explain every little detail on AWS because you'd want to pay me for a 3-day class just for what we're going to talk about with security. All right, now what I'm trying to get at now, my friends, is we need to pay attention to what we configure here and how we configure it, because if we don't pay attention, our blockchain isn't going to work. Okay, so let's go ahead and just double check. We could go with the defaults. In this case, there's no worries there. Availability zone, I have the ability to select an availability zone if I want. Again, I'll take the default. The subnet name, I'm going to leave it as a public subnet. Now an endpoint. Now I don't need an endpoint in this particular case. I'm going to leave that as is. I'm going to leave the DNS the way it is. I'm going to go ahead and create my VPC. Okay, let's go OK. So I have my VPC here. What I want to do now, and again, I could have done this earlier as well, but just to show you how easy it is to at least get started here, what I want to call this is, I'm going to call this basically Hyperledger network, or actually VPC. We'll just leave it as that. Okay. Now, and again, what I want to do is call this and actually save it, and then hit the check mark there. And again, when you do create just if you go over here, you want to tag it appropriately, and you could save it as well. Now that's to create VPC. That's mainly how you'd want to do this, especially if you want to create different subnets. In this case here, we're just going to go with the default config. That's all we really need. And when we get into the exercise a little bit more, we're going to configure a few other areas. So let's go ahead and go on to the next step. And the next step is to create a security group. Now, for those not familiar with AWS, think of a security group as basically a virtual firewall that is going to allow you to facilitate the traffic to the EC2 instance in a manner that is acceptable to your organization. So a firewall, we know what that is. It's just a virtual firewall. It's to mitigate traffic issues. And we're also going to configure rules for outbound and inbound traffic to the instance as well. So let's go over here and select security groups. Now I have, again, some security groups already created. I could just select one of these if I want, but I want to walk you through creating it. I'm going to call this security group, in this case, let's go ahead and call this Demo SG. And I'm going to put Hyperledger for short, just to make it, again, name this whatever you want in your environment. I'm just going to name this something that's easy to see on the screen that I have, and also doesn't overlap with other VPCs, security groups, etc. that I already have. Now the description, I'm going to say this is for my Hyperledger demo class, let's say. And then I need to select the VPC that I just created right there. Okay. Now, remember, the security group is what? This is going to be a virtual firewall. We want to select, again, the the security group and make sure that we also select the proper VPC that's going to be affiliated with this. So let's go create. This is now created. You can see that I have my demo security group for Hyperledger Fabric. Now let's go over to the next exercise and talk about the next. Now the next step is to go over to the security group and select it. And what we have to do is we need to basically select essentially our rules. We need to configure inbound and outbound rules. So what does this really mean? We want to think about the inbound rules as essentially the firewall rules we're going to create to allow traffic into our EC2 instance. And then the outbound rules is basically no more than the traffic that's going to be allowed out of EC2 into the internet. And again, basically inbound is from the internet to EC2, and then outbound is from EC2 to the internet, very simply put. So we need to go edit rules here, basically, and we need to consider a couple rules that we have to add. So let's go ahead and add. Now, we, of course, if we're going to have a blockchain that we're going to access, we need to also access EC2. We need to add some rules. So now what we want to do is add our protocols for web traffic, which is going to be HTTP and HTTPS. Now port 80 is fine. We're going to go ahead and leave this as the default. I'm going to add another rule. I'm going to go over here, put in HTTPS, and actually select HTTPS. And there we go. Those are the two ports that we need to have open to access, for example, web traffic to that VPC, but also any VMs inside of the EC2 instance that we're running as well in the VPC. Okay, now the source, we can customize this. We could add a description if we want. We don't need to make this harder than we need. I'm just going to go ahead and go save the rules. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. I'm going to double check that our inbound rules looks like the way we want it. You can see that we have our source. And if we go over here, this explains the CEDAR notations as well, and the address range as well. So I'm going to go outbound. Now, for the outbound, what we want to do is just validate that all traffic is able to leave the EC2 instance out to the internet in this case. Now, in reality, of course, you're probably not going to want to configure this for your corporate network exactly like this. So it's up to you to determine your security posture. But for development purposes, this is perfectly reasonable. And now what we want to do is go back to the VPC interface. And now what we want to do is launch an EC2 instance. Now, before we launch the EC2 instance, we're going to need to look at a few things here. Now, when we launch an EC2 instance, we're going to want to configure a few things. We're going to, of course, want to configure our subnet information. We, of course, need to discuss our AMI we're going to use. We also need to understand the interface. We need to have an elastic IP. Now, again, there's more to this than what we could cover in a short class that's focused on Hyperledger, not AWS. So what I'd like to do is walk you through how to launch an EC2 instance. When we select Launch EC2, one of the things that comes up is you'll see over here that it says free tier eligible. Now, we can, of course, launch this on a free tier, but for those folks that are not familiar with Amazon, basically an image in Amazon is called an AMI. This is basically our VM image that's going to be deployed to get our virtual machine up and running. And we could choose from different operating systems and different configs as well. So before we get started, when we consider deploying EC2, we need to consider a few things. And with the blockchain template, there's also a few things we want to consider. So the first thing is can we deploy this with free tier or not? And also, can we deploy this with Amazon Linux, or can we deploy this with Ubuntu, SUSE, or Red Hat, etc.? And the answer is it depends. And the reason it depends is it really depends on what your requirements are. Is it for development or is it for production? In this case, for test development and training, we could just go ahead and select a free tier eligible AMI, and it would be just fine. It would meet the requirements. There's no issues of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the first AMI. And as part of this, I could use the T2 micro. Once again, you know, if this is for serious development or production, you probably don't want to use the micro. I generally like to use the general purpose just because if I'm trying to run the Explorer or if I'm trying to run a transaction, there's that chance that latency could come up. So the T2 small generally I've not had issues with. But in your case, T2 micro could be just fine. So if you don't want to get out of the free tier, this will work just fine, especially if you just want to play around and take a look and see how it works after. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it as that. I'm going to go to configure the instance. What I want to do now is I have to select the number of instances. In this case, I only need one instance. I'm not going to create an auto-scaling group. Now, an auto-scaling group is basically a group of VMs that are going to be deployed together that'll have the same configuration and will adjust to the workload. And it's a little bit more than that, but I'll leave it up to you to determine what you want to do. Now, spot instances, probably not something you want to do. Now, a spot instance is going to be a lower cost instance that can be terminated at any time, basically, so you usually don't want to do that. What I want to do now is I'm going to select the network that I created in the VPC, and you can see that it pulled up the VPC subnet as well as part of that. I'm going to basically use a subnet setting. I want to enable that as well in this case. But again, if you want to have a deployment that's going to last and be permanent or just used for testing for a few months, you probably want to talk to your security group, your AWS gurus, and figure out what is the proper config in your case. And I'm just going to go and skip over the rest, but I don't really need to worry about any of this right now. I'm going to actually create a role. I already had some there, but in this case, I'm going to skip over that. We're going to go do that after and affiliate the EC2 with the role. I'm going to go to review and launch. And it says that my configuration is not available for free tier usage, which again is just a warning saying that you're going to pay for this. I'm going to go to launch. Now, okay, now here is something we want to pay attention to. We need to create a key pair. Now, I already have some key pairs, but I'm going to create a new one. I'm going to call this Hyperledger demo KP. I'm going to download the key pair. Now, the key pair is going to be a PEM file. And what I want to do here is make sure that I save this somewhere that I can get to it. And let me just leave it on my desktop just because I need to go back to that later. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and launch the instance. Now, the reason I need to have the PEM file is I'm going to want to be able to SSH into that and access that. And you need to have that key file to be able to do that. All right, so the instance is launching. And what we want to do is go back over here to the EC2 instance, to the EC2 dashboard. And you'll see that this will come up as one running eventually. It may take a minute. So we'll come back to that when it is ready. Okay, now that we have our instance running, what we want to do now is go over here and just validate the status. Okay, that looks like we're up and running. That's great. Now what we want to do is go down here and select Elastic IP. We're going to want to provision an Elastic IP. This is going to allow basically this instance to be accessed from the internet, but also to access the internet. It's basically a publicly available IP, and we want it to be static as well. So I have two Elastic IPs there already. So what I want to do, just for the sake of sanity and make sure I don't overlap anything, I'm going to go ahead and release those IPs just to be safe. It's pretty easy to get confused as well. So I'm just going to go back here, go to Actions, release the IP address. Okay, so now what I want to do, and especially if this is your first time doing this, this is what you'll see. So allocate a new address. Now I had two options. I'm going to go with the Amazon pool because first of all, I don't have any owned by me. And second, if I select this, you'll see that I'll need a custom pool. I didn't set anything up. In this case here, Amazon pool is good. It's going to give me a brand new IP. And that's the one we're going to be using for the Elastic IP for that EC2 instance. Now that we have our IP, we now have to worry about key pairs. So basically, we saved our key pair, and we need to have the key pair for SSH access. So what I want to do is go back to the EC2 dashboard, and you can see that I have key pairs there. So when I select key pairs, I'm going to go and select the key pair that I had just saved, which is this one here. Now, remember down here, you can see that there's a Hyperledger demo, and it's hard to see the PEM file. That's the key pair that I had created earlier. That's what I'm going to use. Now, in case you haven't created a key pair, just go up here to create a key pair, put in a name, and it'll go ahead and create that key pair for you. It's very straightforward, to be honest. Okay, so we have our key pair ready to go. Create your own. In the demo guide, I think it's called Blockchain Book, whatever I named it. Feel free to name it whatever makes sense in your case. For the demo purposes, that's the one I'm going to use right here. Now, we now have our EC2 instance up and running. We have our key file ready to go. We now have to allow access, and also too, we have our Elastic IP as well. And now what we have to do is I need to create another security group, and this security group is going to allow access for TCP. So we need to allow access to get into the VM, for example, like port 22. So let's go ahead and go up to the dashboard again. And what we want to do is go down actually to Network and Security, select Security Groups. Okay, so we had created one already called Hyperledger. This was the one I created for this one, is Demo SG Fabric. And now what I need to do, and you can see there, this is for the demo class. Now, what I want to do now is I have to create another security group. So to do that is, again, fairly straightforward. We already did it. So let's go create a security group. And I'm going to call this basically, in this case, and again, if we go back here, I think I had, again, follow what I gave you, but for me, I'm just going off kilter because I did have a couple demos I created at once. So I'm going to call this, actually, I'm going to call this a blockchain class. And this is the security group for inbound connections, let's say. All right. Now, we have to create an inbound rule. And I'm going to go ahead and add a couple rules in here. So the first thing I'm going to want to add is go up and type in SSH. That'll add port 22. And then if I wanted to have a custom range, I could, or I could say anywhere or my IP. Now, what's nice about my IP is that it'll pick up the IP address that you're using in Amazon Web Services already. So that'll be the address that I'm currently using. Or you could just say anywhere if you want as well. That's your call. So for the purposes of this exercise, I'm going to just leave it anywhere, just in case, because most providers do use DHCP, and I don't want to have any issues playing around. So I'll just leave it open, and then what I typically do is I just shut it off immediately. So that's one rule. Let's go ahead and add another rule. Now, let's say, for example, I want to have monitoring. And if I want to have monitoring, I need to, of course, add whatever protocols for monitoring. In this case here, I'm going to say custom protocol. I'm going to put in HTTP. And I'm going to actually say 8080. So for example, if you wanted to use on-prem Stackdriver or something, you could do that. CloudWatch, it's up to you. Once again, it's your call on what you want to do. And that is the inbound rule. Now, let's go to outbound. And you could just validate that the traffic says all traffic. Now, remember, the first security group was for the virtual private cloud. The second security group here is for the EC2 instance itself. So as I had stated earlier, there's a lot of little details to get right before we could deploy anything. Okay, so let's go create. And that has just created that VPC. So let's just double check our inbound rules. Okay. And outbound should be all traffic. That looks good. And I also want to just clarify here as well that the inbound is correct there and outbound as well, just in case. Okay, so that's really the main thing we want to know for security groups. Okay, so we have some more work to do. We're not done yet. What we want to do now is we need to set an IAM policy. So let's go over to IAM. And if we type in IAM, we'll go over to Identity and Access Management. Okay, we're getting down to the point where we might be able to deploy our CloudFormation stack soon. Now, we're not done yet. So again, I said might because we still got some more work to do. Now, what we want to do is we need to create basically a policy. What we need to do is add basically ECS and EC2 as 3 for CloudFormation to do its work. Now, for time purposes and complexity of the class, in reality, I'm not going to go through IAM and how to do all these little details and policies. Again, that's literally a 3-day class in a lot of cases with AWS to go through all this. So what I did is I already created a policy, and it's called ECS S3. So that's the one we're going to be using. So just be aware. And this is called EC2 blockchain. And that's the policy name. This gives us the ARN we're going to need as well. Again, it tells us other information that we want to know. But for the purposes, again, it's sort of hard to get into roles, policies, and everything. So what we want to do now is get this ready for us to actually do some work with Hyperledger. So let's go ahead and move on to the next part. And now also, if one thing I point out too, is under roles, we need to create a role. And what I did is, and again, you have the instructions in a download if you want to go step by step by step. But for time purposes, I need to keep it under a certain amount of time. And we go into verify our role, and we have the policy ECS S3 that we just looked at tied to this role called EC2 blockchain. Now, there is another 20 steps if you want to go through them in the download document on how to create roles and policies and permissions. Leave that up to you to decide if you want to do or not. All right, so let's go back to the dashboard here and let's get started on deploying our. Okay, now what we want to do is go back to the CloudFormation stack and get our blockchain template deployed. Now, what we want to do is we're going to deploy our blockchain stack. Okay, now what we want to do is deploy our stack. I'm going to call this Blockchain Book 2 because I had previously deployed Blockchain Book, so I'll call it number 2. I'm going to leave the default parameters the way it is. I just changed it to testnet instead of the default. I selected our VPC that was just created. And then I also selected the subnet as well. And then we want to make sure we select the proper keep here that we saved as well as created when we deployed the EC2 instance. And we also need to make sure we have the proper security group. Now, what we have to do is get the instance profile ARN. What we want to do to get that is we have to go back to IAM and go over to the summary of the role that we created. Go over here and copy the role ARN. Don't copy the instance profile ARN. That will get you nowhere. Let's go ahead and copy that. Paste that in. And now we're going to go ahead and leave the defaults the way it is. There's no need to change them. And then you'll see here that it has some acknowledgments. We do need to acknowledge that CloudFormation is going to do what it has to do, basically. I'll leave it at that. Now, CloudFormation is, again, a subject in itself beyond the scope of the class. But remember, CloudFormation, I told you earlier, is essentially an infrastructure as code solution for AWS. Now, what I want to do is create the stack. Now, this is going to go ahead and create the stack. It shows that it is basically status is creation in progress. We'll go back to that once it's done. This may take 1 to 2 minutes, maybe 3, it depends. It's usually pretty quick though. Okay, so it completed. So you can see create complete, and we go down here. Now what we want to do is go to outputs. Outputs is going to list our Explorer URL. Now, when I select the URL, it's going to bring up the Explorer. Now, if this doesn't work, let's say you get basically a can't connect error, chances are you don't have port 8080 enabled in your EC2 security group. For example, might be enabled in the VPC, but not in the EC2 instance that's been deployed. So check that. Okay, so now for the cool part, we go over here and we can see that we have some blocks added. Now, block 0 is our Genesis block. And then block 1 is the next block that's created after. And then over here under the peer graph, you can see that we have our 3 different peers that were deployed. And when I go down here, you can see that I can expand them and move them around and view them however. Now, there isn't much activity going on because we haven't initiated an activity. This is just basically kicking off our blockchain, getting the Genesis block created. And then this is our two organizations. Now, if we go over here, this is our dashboard here. Now, our network, you can see that we have our URL requests right there. Blocks are listed here. And again, information that might be helpful, and our transactions that occurred. Now, we don't have any contracts loaded, so that's not going to show that. All right, so that is how you simply deploy Hyperledger Fabric template, blockchain template that is, on AWS. And as part of that, it deploys the Hyperledger Explorer. So that concludes this demo. Let's go ahead and move on.